This is a pretty extensive topic on PRITE. So I obviously cannot cover it all, but I try to give a little bit of background knowledge for all of the answers and stuff. So I'm gonna go be a little bit quickly, but it should be there and I'll make it available on the Google site website for you to be able to go back and look at it and ask questions. So question number 1, and we'll see if I can get this poll to work. Okay, can you guys see that question? Somebody unmute and let me know.
Yeah, Mel, we can see it.
Okay, so question number 1, lesions on the orbitofrontal subcortical circuit produce which of the following behaviors? Does it cause plasticity and apathy, diminished libido, disinhibition, impulsivity, and tactlessness, hypergraphia, circumstantiality, hypersexuality, or hyperreligiosity? All right. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end that poll. Nice job. So everyone was able to answer that correctly, so we can hopefully go through this pretty quickly, but I'm gonna add on a little bit extra to add to that. So answer is C, disinhibition, impulsivity, and tactlessness. So when we think about frontal subcortical, it's nice to kind of actually think about the location. So you're in the front of the brain and going through the orbital area. So think of Phineas Gauge. So we think about impulse control and social behavior problems. There are several different circuits in the subcortical area, but they're specifically talking about the orbital frontal. And when we talk about that, the orbital frontal area, it's talking about association fibers. And I'm bringing this up because you'll have other questions about this, and it actually ties into some other things in the other answer choices. So the white fibers or the neurons, whatever, the white matter gets bundled into descent signals. And when you're joining other areas of the cortex in the one atmosphere, talking about association fibers. Association fibers are one of 3 types of white matter fibers. There's chemistryla, which goes between hemispheres. So association fibers are just within the same hemisphere, and then projection fibers that go to other areas, including gray and white matter. So, and then we have the basal ganglia. Again, here, association fibers, they can be really short, like an arch or arcuate, or they can be really long. And these are some, I'm not going to go into them just for the sake of time, but there are questions that ask about what happens or what these controls. So as we're looking back at them. Well, I know this is really busy, but in the question, the right side here, let me orient you, these are all of the answer choices. So plasticity apathy is really talking about Cliver-Bucy. So think about the monkey who doesn't really react to the snake. They can put weird things in their mouth. Diminished libido is really talking about the dopamine pathway, the reward pathway. And so people can get problems with the ventral tegmental area down here and the nucleus accumbens. And then, as we said, the Phineas Gauge kind of scenario with disinhibition, impulsivity, and tactlessness is the frontal part near the orbit. And then the last 2 answer choices actually kind of go together with temporal lobe epilepsy. And I really like this picture just of the writing because you think about hypergraphia, you think about the hyperreligiosity, and then seizures or epilepsy. So question number 2, let's see if I can get this poll. Orexin neurons involved in the regulation of appetite arise from which part of the hypothalamus? So involved in the regulation of appetite. For a second here. All right. So I'm going to share the results here. So I love the answer choices that are here. I will tell you that most of you are wrong, but I understand why, and I'm going to try to explain it. So the correct answer is the arcuate nucleus. So when we think about the hypothalamus is not really a complete structure like you picture, like you can see in this picture, but it's more of a collection of nuclei. So when we look at it, we can kind of divide it into three areas. We're going to mainly focus on this central area, tubular area, but I'm going to go through all of them just in case you get questions on them. And then it's always helpful to orient yourself when you're looking at a picture. So this is the optic chiasma, these are the mammillary bodies, and that's kind of a way to get yourself oriented there. So when we think about the hypothalamus, let me actually, before we do that, let me go through the answers. So you're probably like lateral, like food, hunger, orexin deals with like things, sounds like anorexia, right? So it should be lateral. That is the correct nucleus, but it's actually the arcuate. I'll go over that in a second. But it does produce orexin, so you do have a correct connection there. Ventral medial is kind of a little bit below the lateral, so if you follow here, and so once you are eating the food, then you should trigger that you're full. And then you have the arcuate nucleus that kind of runs between the lateral and the ventral medial. So if that kind of helps you with a visual to kind of see the connection as I explain. But arcuate nucleus, we often think about dopamine production and the inhibition of prolactin, but is also importantly involved in secreting hypothalamic releasing factors that impact the pituitary gland. The median eminence, which I'm going to go over in a second, and then the paraventricular nucleus, which is dealing with water balance. So the median eminence, it's kind of above the stalk of the pituitary gland, and you can see it's got kind of connections filtering things into the pituitary and around. So again, the answer is arcuate. So I want to clue you into this word regulation of appetite. So orexin neurons are involved, okay, but they're dealing with the regulation of appetite. So breaking down the hypothalamus, we have the anterior part. I don't know how many of you guys have heard of this like mnemonic or whatever with a cow, but we deal with the front of the cow as the anterior part. The big ones they mentioned in the question were the paraventricular. I always think about the V between the horn and the ear, and it's above the eyes. So we're dealing with longing into someone's face, looking longingly, attachment, and then also tears, water balance. Suprachiasmic nucleus is also here. So think about between the two eyes there, we're going to be registering day and night and that circadian rhythm. And then the anterior nucleus, hypothalamic nucleus, which is dealing with, think about like a cold nose. So it's supposed to be sensing and releasing heat. And that's via the parasympathetic nervous system. Then we have the posterior hypothalamic nucleus, my fave, where we're going to be conserving heat. So think about it would be a miserable death in the cold Arctic. And so when people die, their temperature drops. So we want to fight for life, and our sympathetic nervous system comes in, and we have the methane gas that can light on fire. And then in between there, so we just again to contrast parasympathetic and sympathetic. In between there, we have the lateral and the tuberal or medial hypothalamus. So the lateral, you're correct, it does produce orexin, it detects hunger. But then we have the ventral medial nucleus, which is kind of opposite of that. Once you get the food down, it's going to detect satiety, I can't say that word, and tell you to stop eating. But that all comes in with the arcuate nucleus. So yes, the arcuate nucleus, we have to think about like the udders dealing with milk, secreting dopamine to inhibit prolactin. But it also regulates the anterior pituitary gland by secreting those hypothalamic releasing factors. And so when you think about regulating, the way that it's going to do that, oh, I'm sorry, is the orexin's actually going to come and act on the arcuate nucleus. And the arcuate nucleus is like a pacemaker. So it's hanging here in between the pituitary, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, like it's all kind of in there, bridging between the ventral medial nucleus, the lateral nucleus, and really regulating or being the pacemaker for appetite. So when we think about the question, we really need to think about the key words here. So regulation, right? It's going to be that pacemaker. And then the appetite is really where that desire to eat. So the lateral nucleus is going to detect hunger and secrete the erection, but then the arcuate nucleus is going to be the one actually regulating it. So I answered lateral, and I tried to answer it lateral 1,000 times, but it's arcuate. So just know that that arch between the lateral and the ventral medial and the pituitary. Question number 3, the neural circuit that connects the anterolateral orbital frontal cortex, the anterior part of the putamen, and the thalamus is involved in which of the following cognitive functions? And at the end of the day, don't worry about what answer you get. We're going to learn. So go with your gut, and then I won't even show the answers. Okay, I lied. I'm going to show it because it's so spread out, which is great. So we're going to learn. So we have quite a spread. The answer is actually B, response inhibition. And so I think when it comes to this question, we have to kind of break down. So neuroscience questions, when you say long question, just presume that's neuroscience, and you got to do some underlining, highlighting, whatever. So when we think about circuits, which I mentioned in the question, like I said before, there's 3 types: association, projection, and commissural. We're going to focus on projection fibers. So they're the ones that go from white matter, like cortex, to gray matter places like the basal ganglia, thalamus, etc. So when we think about the stem, it says anterolateral orbital frontal cortex. That's a mouthful, but at the end of the day, just focus on the word cortex. I got white matter. Then I have the anterior part of the putamen. So Anatomy lesson again. So we're thinking about the basal ganglia. It has lots of different parts, but the putamen is part of that. And it's in fact even simplified. It often has, like, you think about these like striped areas, black and white striatum. That's where that word comes from. The putamen is part of that. And then we have our thalamus, which is kind of like a post office here. So, again, the questions mentioned the cortex, the putamen, which is actually part of the striatum, are these striped black and white. So we have the gray and white. We have the gray matter of the putamen and the globus pallidus and the caudate, and then we have white matter in between there. And then our thalamus, which is our red structure here. If you know a different term, corticostriatal-thalamic tract or circuit, you'll realize that this is like a very complex pathway. So think about complex processes that we're going to be controlling. So if you can think about the basal ganglia and what that has to do with, it might help you with this answer. So the pathway, if you want to, I'm going to let you guys look at this video later just for time's sake, but basically the thalamus is getting that glutamate firing off to the cerebral cortex to create some movement, let's say. And then the cerebral cortex is like, yes, move. And that efferent glutamate is actually kicking into the striatum. And here we're going to try to, like, coordinate it. We don't want to go in haywire, crazy movement. Your body's like going crazy. So we have to kind of control that. And so whenever we think about control, we can promote, inhibit, try to modify that. You need some kind of inhibitory process. So our striatum is really involved in that GABAergic kind of process. And it's going to be kind of modifying the free-flowing glutamate and our thalamus wanting to cause movement. So the cortex, the striatum, the putamen, which they refer to in this scenario, and the thalamus, that circuit really controls movement execution. And in turn, we like those to turn to habit. And some habits are rewarding. So it all kind of goes together. And they're activated when we want to actually respond or not respond. And then kind of some control over that. So the answer here is response inhibition. All right, so just try to pause and pull out in the question the different parts and really kind of picture that anatomy in your mind. And when we think about the basal ganglia and the striatum, we're really thinking about the response to things, and we can inhibit or promote that by using the putamen and the basal ganglia striatum. All right, this just kind of looking at the other answer choices. Working memory is a dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Like, man, it's a lot of words. It is. Some of the stuff you just have to kind of go back and memorize or spend some time on things that are more confusing. Default mode processing or internal processing is the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, the precuneus, which we'll talk about later, and the posterior cingulate cortex. And then emotions, thinking about the limbic system, amygdala, insula, arcuate. All right, just a bonus, you don't have to answer any questions here. But one of the things here was talking about the limbic system. So one of the questions they had on neuroscience was about which of the following nuclei are part of it. So if you want to go back and look at some other nuclei in the systems, I have some images here, but the raphe are dealing with the serotonin, and they're a part of the reticular formation. The reticulum means like net, and if you like remember in the brainstem, you see all the black and white fibers crossing over and stuff like that. You have the RAS center there for sleep-wake cycle. And then the dentate it looks like serrated teeth in the cerebellum. So we're dealing with voluntary movement and thinking, coordinating that. And then the vestibular, think of the ear and equilibrium and stuff like that. So septum is a part of the limbic, which you can see in these pictures, the septal nucleus, a part of that limbic system. All right, question number 4. Disruption of the cortical striato cortical circuit function is most closely associated with which group of disorders? Don't search the answer. Think about it based on what we just talked about and the previous question while I load the poll. So we're going to disrupt the cortical striatothalamic cortical circuit. What could be a disorder? I love the answers that we're picking. All right. So the answer is obsessive compulsive. So you think about the compulsion, these behaviors. So we can't control them. All right. So we talk about that pathway of controlling or deciding whether we're going to do something. We're often thinking about abnormal movements when we think about that basal ganglion coordinating that movement. So Parkinson's, Tourette's, cerebral palsy, etc., and obsessive compulsive disorder is in there. Schizophrenia, maybe if you're thinking of tardive dyskinesia, you could think about with that. But we're thinking about that whole circuit, not just the basal ganglia, but the circuit, the coordinating of that. All right, question 5. During administration of performance tasks on standardized intelligence testing, which of the following areas shows the greatest increase in metabolic activity? Is it A, left parietal lobe, B, left temporal lobe, C, right parietal lobe, D, right temporal lobe, or E, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex? And I like that we have a spread of answers. This will be a good discussion. Go with your gut if you haven't answered. Perfect. All right, so we have a spread of answers. But I think we have to ask ourselves, what do we consider intelligence? And so I think that thinking about how people test for gifted and talented will be very telling. Okay, so the actual answer is right parietal lobe, right? And the reason being is that gifted and talented, when they think about intelligence, they look at the ability to use visual spatial skills, because that's often neglected in the standard academic setting. And so when we think about math and verbal, we're often thinking about the answer choices that you guys picked. But when we think about this, a way to think differently, the kind of imaginative part, oftentimes they used to use a screener where they would divide a paper into 4 squares, and they would draw a random odd shape, and they would see how somebody would draw. And they were shapes that would kind of lead people to give kind of standard answers, and then see if people could come up with some unique way. I actually had a student who actually combined all 4 squares into one giant drawing. It was like a whole story. So kind of this idea of left brain, right brain. So left brain is all of these analytical things, verbal, mathematical, stuff like that, which we often need and is addressed in school. But in addition to somebody just having basic learning things, when we get more artistic and creative and imaginative, we think about this intelligence with like gifted and talented. And so when we looked at the electrical potentials that were firing in people with a higher intelligence quotient, they actually saw more firing in the right parietal area of the brain. We can kind of see opposite of that, like in strokes for visual spatial areas of the parietal lobe, they have difficulty with detecting what they're touching, sense of depth, identifying things without vision, and they can neglect things. So again, when we think about intelligence quotient, thinking about gifted and talented, we're thinking of kind of thinking outside the box. We can, so the right parietal. All right, question number 6. A researcher is involved in testing a new environmental pollutant found to be a neurotoxin. After injecting the agent into the experimental animal brain, the levels of tyrosine hydroxylase dramatically decrease. Which of the following types of neurons are most likely to be impaired by this neurotoxin? Think about your answer while I fire our poll. And don't worry, go with your gut. If you don't know, we're just gonna learn. Perfect. All right. Let me show you here the results. All right, so we have a good spread. The good news is some of you got it right. So let's talk about the answers and help hopefully remember, not just memorize. All right. So the answer is A, dopaminergic. And so when we think about neurotransmitters, there's lots of different categories. One of them is monoamines. So I want to talk about this one as it relates to the question stem and dopamine. So the amino acids that can make monoamines are tryptophan, phenylalanine, and tyrosine. Tryptophan is the one. So when you think about, like, if you were studying for boards and people told you don't pack a turkey sandwich, don't be the lion, eating a big meaty meal. Don't be a Thanksgiving dinner where you find yourself sleeping afterwards because it's high in tryptophan. So I always think of turkey, tryptophan, and I might trip and fall and go to sleep. So serotonin, melatonin come from that. When we think about phenylalanine and tyrosine, they're related to each other. So phenylalanine actually becomes tyrosine. And if you look at their structure, they're very similar. And honestly, the only difference is a hydroxyl group. And so if we think about the name of tyrosine, it doesn't, why do they call it tyrosine if it's almost like phenylalanine? And it's because it was actually discovered in cheese experiments. And the Greek word for cheese is tyros. So thank you to the Greeks for making this confusing. But the actual chemical name is 4-hydroxy phenylalanine. And I want to point out the O and the P here, because that's going to become important in a second. All right. So we're supposed to make this into dopamine, which is actually dihydroxy hydroxy, so DO, and then phenylthiamine. So it's very similar. So if you can remember, the P and dopamine is from the phenylalanine, and the DO is from the two hydroxyl groups that are added on. So one extra from tyrosine. Hopefully you can start to remember that phenylalanine is the source of dopamine. You have the tyrosine hydroxylase enzyme adding on the hydroxyl group. And then the dopamine will eventually become norepinephrine and epinephrine. And then when we think about the question stem, so again, the tryptophan becomes a serotonin and melatonin. And then that is an amine. So it's a amine group that makes up amino acids, but it's not the whole amino acid anymore. Phenylalanine, like we said, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine. Histidine is almost the same as the amino acid that it, the amine group that it becomes, which is histamine. And so it gives you the little name at the end, amine, to tell you that it's a amine of histidine, which is an amino acid. So glutamate, the amino acid, can become arginine, which is also an amino acid, which will then become nitric oxide, which is a gas, which is very easy getting into lots of cells. Threonine, it can become glycine, which is also an amino acid and functions as an amino acid. And then glutamine becomes glutamate and is also an amino acid. So just things to keep in mind. So again, tyrosine hydroxylase, so tyrosine, I would say tyrosine. Tyrosine is the cheese that you get from the phenylalanine, and then you can add on a hydroxy group to make dye, and then the oxy, and then the P for phenylalanine. Question 7. Which of the following neurotransmitters directly activates soluble guanylyl cyclase, leading to the production of cyclic guanylyl monophosphate? Is it glycine, substance P, neuroligin, octopamine, or nitric oxide? Go with your gut. Don't worry if you're wrong. It's okay. Perfect. All right. So answer, oops, sorry, is nitric oxide. When we think about nitric oxide, I'm sorry, the question, Sam, which of the following neurotransmitters directly activates soluble guanylyl cyclase, leading to the production of cyclic guanylyl monophosphate? So kind of trying to think about, I know these words are really long. Sometimes I get in the habit of getting a little overwhelmed when I see really long words and forgetting the shorter version that I recognize. So cyclic guanylyl monophosphate is just like a CGMP. That is kind of a downward cascade kind of process. And something that can very easily activate that is something that can easily get into the cells and cause that. So nitric oxide is the substance. Nitric oxide, sorry, is a gas. It's very lipid soluble. It's reactive as a free radical. So it likes to go to lots of different things. And I always think a free radical is bad and a heart attack is bad. And so if I want to give somebody nitric oxide in the case of a heart attack, I want this stuff firing off quickly because I need to dilate their blood vessels and get blood going and bronchodilation. So that's why we give nitric oxide nitroglycerin tablets, right? So just think about this is a process that can have a pretty broad impact when you think about downward cascade of things, and cyclic GMP is one of those things where we're taking off the phosphate groups, and you can get a pretty significant response. For the other things, other answer choices, glycine regulates glutathione, which is an antioxidant. Substance P we think about with pain, and it could specifically stimulating the NK1 receptor. Neuroligin actually maintains neuronal synapses. And then I think this is the coolest thing, octopamine is the version of basically dopamine in invertebrates. I guess that's why they call it octo for octopus, but that's how I remember it. So nitric oxide, it's a free radical, but it gets into lots of things. So it's small gas, it's lipid soluble, and it can cause a big reaction, a good response when we have somebody who needs vasodilation. Question 8, in the image, which number corresponds to the precuneus? Go with your gut. If you don't know, don't look it up. We'll go over it. And I need to fire the poll, sorry. And I think you can click on the image if you need to make it bigger for that reason. Can't go wrong answering whatever. If you don't know the answer, pick your best idea. Process elimination, get it down to 2, pick one. Ten more seconds. All right. So pretty big spread, which is fine. So I think this question got a lot of us last year, so I'm going to go over that. Well, the answer is C3, precuneus. And so, I think the first thing is just to remember what pre means. Pre means before. So the only one that's not before anything here is number 4. So you can probably eliminate that one, but let's be sure. So cuneus means wedge in Latin. So when we think back to our picture here, this area is our wedge, and we're before the wedge. So precuneus is before the cuneus or the wedge. The number 1, I am assuming is talking about the gyrus rectus, but it may be involved in personality. Number 2 is the precentral lobular. We got the motor and sensory gyri there, so motor sensory function. And then the precuneus is somatosensory, so kind of dealing with how your body relates to all the sensation and stuff like that. And then the cuneus is vision. So we're detecting all this sensation, and then we got to make sense of it in the precuneus. Number 9. Which of the following neurotransmitters has been most implicated in the pathogenesis of schizophrenia spectrum disorders? If you don't know it, make a guess. Can you guys see that number 9?
No, not yet.
Let me figure out what happened here. Um, Let me watch. Well, don't know what I did.
So Mel, if you close the poll and it will not open up, like for everybody to vote.
Oh wait, I think I got it. Okay, never mind. I forgot to stop sharing that one. Okay. All right. So we have a pretty big spread here. The actual answer is E, neurotensin. So let's go through and see if we can figure out how to keep that straight. So apelin is neuroprotective. So think of like anti-apoptotic. So think about neurodegenerative diseases is impacted with this. So Parkinson's disease, strokes, things like that. Oxytocin, we think about like social relationships of disorders where that can be dysregulated autism, anxiety, depression, and psychotic disorders, and borderline personality. Prolactin, we think about stress and pain and sexual dysfunction. So I often think about like things that can go wrong, like pain with prolactin in all the way up through like male and female. So migraines, pelvic pain, sexual dysfunction. Calcitonin, I'm really talking about calcitonin gene-related peptide, is dealing with migraines specifically. So there's a little bit of overlap with prolactin and calcitonin, and it can cause vasodilation, inflammatory responses. And then neurotensin, it actually is supposed to be like an antipsychotic. So if it's abnormal, then it's causes psychosis. So, and then question 10, last but not least, which of the following is a peptide hormone that has increased plasma levels in between meals? Which of the following is a peptide hormone that has increased plasma levels in between meals? Go with your gut. So we have a spread here. The answer is ghrelin, but let's go over it because these are all involved in meals. So this is where it can get a little bit confusing and feel a little bit overwhelming, so. So I think this picture is nice when we have like all of them lighting up red except for ghrelin, which is green. So I always think of ghrelin as like grrr, like my stomach is growling. So in between meals, the ghrelin is increasing to tell you to take in food. And then during meals, everything is kind of like putting out things, but trying to get you to like stop eating. So it's gonna slow things down so it can get digested and then tell you, hey, we're full, notice this and stop eating. You don't need to make orexin anymore. And the arcuate nucleus is making signals to change over. So when we think about ghrelin, it is again the hunger hormone. So it's going to stimulate appetite, and in fact, it's an orexinogenic hormone. So it's a type of orexin. So they're very similar. And then again, this is going to be working on the arcuate nucleus. The leptin is going to decrease as well as the cholecystokinin, GLP-1. And I think about the GLP-1, we give these to people who we want them to reduce their food intake. So we don't want to give it in between meals. Or we don't give it when we do it when they're eating, so they'll stop eating. And then tyrosine, I always think about tyrosine, we're getting that from our food, and so we need it to slow things down while we're eating. So this is going to increase so that we're going to slow down our digestive system, digest things, get them in, and stop eating. The only one that's going to be fired while our stomach is growling is ghrelin. And then, yep, so leptin makes you thin, ghrelin makes you grow or gobble or growl. And that's the end. Who's hungry? That's all I got.